Zoltan Ginelli is a geographer and global historian at the University of Public Service in Budapest, Hungary. He follows a world systemic and decolonial approach to study the global history of Hungarian coloniality and the relations between Eastern Europe and the global South. In 2020, he co-curated the exhibition Trans-Periphery Movement. Currently, he's finishing his book, The Global Histories of the Quantitative Revolution, and a co-written book on the global history of Hungarian coloniality for Cambridge University Press. Professor Ginelli, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I put the screen, put it full screen.
Yes, we can see full screen.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay. So thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I have to warn you that, as always, I have a lot of slides. So I try to rehearse this presentation, but I'm not sure that I will finish. The reasons for this is that we are writing the book, which was mentioned, which is about Hungary between the colonial and anti-colonial worlds. And we have accumulated so much interesting materials that it's really hard to select those which would be the best for demonstrating my main thesis, which is semiperipheral whiteness, which is actually an approach to whiteness and race from world systems analysis, but also from other authors and approaches connected to this coming from post-colonial studies and from decolonialism. And I think why this is a very important and interesting topic, especially in relation to African studies, is that I've been dealing with how to position Eastern Europe within the global histories of colonialism and race. And I think that Hungary offers a very significantly silenced and under-researched instance or case of this Eastern European position, which I will call semi-peripheral in structural terms. So through these vast amounts of historical examples, what I try to show you, hopefully successfully, is throughout Hungarian integration into global colonialism, how can we see this specific semi-peripheral positioning of being both whites and identifying with the white position, and also being partly non-whites or not quite whites, or Hungarians themselves, Hungarians being racialized by the global core, which is considered white and holds, the power of whitening, so to say. So actually, my background in geography led me to look at colonial history in Hungary, because geography is inherently a colonial science. So I started already as a bachelor student studying discourses of coloniality and race, and there was a total absence of literature connected to or related to geography, which is a striking thing if you consider that race is inherently a geographical concept. So it's not just about biology, inheritance, and other cultural and social expressions and forms of racializing, but it's inherently a geographic concept. So it does matter where you are and how your geographic conditions and positions affect or produce your racial position. And this concept will help us also understand the recent political discourses around coloniality, which are inherently connected to race. So that's why sometimes I will use the concept of racial colonialism. But to start off, I try to summarize each slide in quite short manner to go through all of the other slides. The initial problem when encountering Eastern Europe and also Hungary is this West-centric knowledge hegemony, which also affects and conditions knowledge, available knowledge here, And in the available knowledge, if you read post-colonial studies or any kind of academic literature connected to colonial history and partly to race and racialization. Now, there are some approaches and some case studies which, of course, demonstrate how race and coloniality could be understood. In the case of Hungary, perhaps race is more important because there's Jewish history and Roma history which have exploited these ideas. But overall, how we are connected to global colonialism have been underemphasized, and our global positions in terms of race. The Westcentric knowledge hegemony has been problematic because they're using mostly US-centered or Western, British, Anglo-Saxon terms which are connected to their history. So it's not obvious what race means in Hungary if you look at the historical record of how race or coloniality has been understood. So for example, this colorism in US literature is very strongly diverting the local context and conditions of what race actually meant in the East European and the Hungarian context. And what has been the habit of Hungarian political commentators and academics also is importing West-centric and Western frameworks, and therefore applying, concepts from post-school studies in this region. And my argument is that this is not just not enough, but this is very problematic because some of these histories are complicated through the ways that the region and Hungary was structurally integrated into the world economy, which then this structural condition offers a very different understanding of what race and coloniality actually meant and was meant to express. So usually politicizing this liberal revolt in the region and specifically in Hungary was about, from the leftist circles, was about a deviation from liberal democracy, growing authoritarianism, and Hungary became an instance of white supremacy. So anti-racist immigration, racist anti-immigration politics, for example, was just a case of growing fascism, which is part of a wider global trend of growing global fascist and white supremacist coalitions. So the politics by the government, Hungarian government, was made an instance of this. Even those these studies were also they did not actually treat race, and especially not colonialism, and did not treat the new colonial rhetoric applied by these governments. Even Karl Marx's book is a bright exception, although Karl Marx's work, for example, uses the concept of semi-periphery in a very descriptive manner and not as an epistemic approach to understanding this whiteness. And in addition, his Western position also casts a sort of idealization of, in my interpretation, of Central Europe, of the region, which does not offer a wider and deeper global history of how race and colonialism and this racialization of Eastern Europeans as not quite whites happened. So throughout history. And these issues have become really politicized through the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I don't have time to go into details, but the specific characteristics of this discourse was that it was very West-centric, in the sense that obviously Ukrainians were appealing for Western support, although they were also highlighting that Ukrainians have been racialized throughout history as non-whites or not quite whites. And they were also putting forth the argument that there's a need to decolonize Russian history because Russian history is inherently, and Russian culture inherently colonial imperialist. So the problem with this critique, to put it very simply, is that it's not really integrating this Ukrainian critique in global terms. And when you see the African vote in the UN and the reluctance of many countries in the global South to condemn the Russian invasion, you can see that this global history of colonialism quite complicates the Ukrainian case, which is not really put in dialogue by these authors. And they are writing about Western colonialism. They are actually bypassing the role of Western colonialism in relation to the global South. It's not put into dialogue, and I like to highlight further criticism on decolonialism as a literature and academic approach and practice. And I would say as it has been practiced by academics, usually has been captured by identity politics. I like to highlight this quote by Morgan Quaintance in the realm of art and artistic production, that the West is again the fixed monolith of normativity, and its prejudice towards Asians, Africans, and others becomes the only prejudice that exists, and the tie that superficially binds other nations. The ideas, expressions, and experiences of majority world artists and theorists are distorted, simplified, and framed by a white European art world bourgeoisie, so that a white European art world bourgeoisie can listen and learn lessons about otherness, the outcomes of which they have devised themselves. So the critique that decolonialism have become self-centered and become has become something that is capitalizing on actually white privilege in the structural sense that it remains to be the voice of the global core and not about those that they are talking about or addressing, is also addressed by Olfemi Taivo's book, Against Decolonialism. So I'd like to highlight this criticism also because decolonialism has been all captured by the right and also by conservative circles, and it has become an issue that decolonialism is not really about contesting the structure of politics and structural inequalities, also in academic knowledge production, but just about offering another shade of criticism through which you can popularize your individual academic careers. So holding decolonial sessions in Barcelona, for example, in London or Utrecht or Stockholm is very different from holding decolonial sessions in Budapest or Bucharest or Bratislava or some other, or Kiev now would be very interesting, with the invitation of, for example, African scholars or Asian scholars who are also writing about decolonialism. Okay, so there's a need to globalize this critique, also because the recent, in the past few years, recent wave of decolonization struggles, as you could see, also connected to the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA, this discourse has been globalized. And one of the reasons, the impulses of why this has been globalized was the George Floyd incident. Now in 2020 summer, it swept through the region, also Hungary. Everybody commented about slavery, the George Floyd incident, and racism and anti-racism, and tried to position him or herself. At the Black Lives Matter supporting anti-racist demonstration in Budapest, there were mostly foreigners present, and curiously also those who were descendants of those who came to Hungary previously, for example, in the socialist era. This history was not really discovered through these debates. The main argument was exceptionalism. We had a different history. And this was something which united the liberals and the conservatives. And also another argument that we don't have race. So there were no blacks here, there was no slavery here, we did not connect to Atlantic slavery. So we are not responsible for the crimes of the West. Also, there was West mimicry, Roma Lives Matter, for example, from liberal circles. The Momentum Party was very active in promoting this claim of including our racialized minorities into the big Western discussions. And it was similar to the George Floyd incident, to the color revolutions, which swept across North Africa, Middle East, and Eastern Europe, that Western frameworks of political action were adopted or resisted. It was a performative reconfiguring the relations to the global core. So this is what I call West simulacrum, which might be exemplified by this one case of a 3D printed so-called Black Lives Matter public art statue, which was erected in Budapest at that time, which was supported by the opposition district mayor, Cristina Baranyi. It was a rainbow-colored, half-kneeling, fist up, Statue of Liberty character with a BLM inscription on the book cover. And it was meant to be destroyed, actually, and it was right away by far-right and neo-Nazi protesters who first covered it with boards and posters about the threats of anti-white propaganda and with crosses on the top, as you could see. So it was later destroyed, and the government spokesperson, Gergely Gulyás, said the following: in the United States, Black Lives Matter is a fundamentally racist movement that does not recognize the equal rights of people of color and people of color. Accordingly, it is contrary to all norms or all normal human rights thinking that accepts the standards of the 20th century. Therefore, it is not racist to oppose a statue to Black Lives Matter, but to erect a statue to this movement. So Black Lives Matter was turned racist because it was about the division of and inequality of races. The discourse was inverted by the Hungarian government. And also the West simulacrum means that there's a West-centric mimicry and channeling of political frameworks from the West, whatever side on the political spectrum you are, including anti-colonial and anti-racist politics, has become a simulacrum, a simulated reality constructed by local political powers to gain capital from these discussions, and locks the focus on the West and the USA, on this East-West axis on which Hungary should be positioned, and does not let local historical experiences and discourse to be discussed outside these frameworks. Now, also there has been this embracing whiteness as an anti-Western revolt, or Viktor Orbán once said that we Hungarians are not a mixed race and we do not want to become a mixed race. This was addressing immigration politics in Europe and also in the West, and we do not want non-whites and other people coming here, right? It was about our indigenous culture will not be washed away by liberal globalists. It was addressing multiculturalism, gender, LGBTQ rights, which are all liberal illnesses of a waning West. Feminism is a liberal attack on the reproduction of the nation. And feminist roles are also, sometimes feminism is countered by Fidesz conservative role models, politicians like Katalin Novák, who became in 2020 the president of Hungary. Now, however, what race means and how it's complicated in Hungary history was de-emphasized. So race could mean faj or ras. Both means race. Faj is actually a more complex concept. It had geographical, cultural meanings, and often was identical to nation. This also shows the long-term history of how the idea of nation came from the idea of competing races, and how the racial state actually bred the idea of nation. Okay. Now, this was also connected to these discourses to bordering white Europe. So liberal immigrationism is also a result of Western colonialism. We had a different history, and intersectionality and liberal individualism is only used as an imperialist politics to divide and conquer nations and strip them from their sovereignty. So this is a security rhetoric, but protecting the nation and white Christian Europe against non-white threat, connected also to Islamophobia, which is strongly exploited. Now, what's the emphasis is that the proving that we are whites also had an economic function in maintaining that we are the legitimate benefactors of European goodness. It's actually, this is a part of post-colonial competition between the post-socialist Eastern European states admitted into the Schengen area and the post-colonial, Asian diaspora, which have also integrated into European Union through economic and social ties. So there was this Hungarian colonial turn, which is a remarkable politicization of colonial discourse after 2012. Previously, it was a minor element mobilized by the far right, and now it's on the level, it has become on the level of government level state propaganda, also used in foreign policy. It was actually born as a reaction to the 2008 and 2009 crisis, a revolt against the neoliberal order after 1989, so the neoliberal market transition, which is ironic because the same figures, politicians of Fidesz, were involved in the system change. But now they got a 2/3 majority consecutively after 2010. So this critique was against global financialization. We will not become a colony of the West. Notably, the government paid back the IMF loans in 2013. So there was some legitimation behind this critique. It's also connected to George Soros, which some have said that this is part of an anti-Semitic critique, as him being of Jewish origin, but it's actually against global capitalists, which wants to wipe out our indigenous culture. So it's actually a hidden critique against capitalism. We must protect also against the EU. So this critique shifted against the EU, which wants to impose its politics onto us. So it's intertwined with this post-socialist experience that we remember when bureaucrats dictated to us within a centralized order, as within the communist times. Brussels is the new Moscow, and we must stop Brussels, the imperial center. Meanwhile, of course, there are low taxes for large companies, foreign companies, and also the automotive industry is promoted, which is mostly behind that the German capital, so which is notorious for production flexibility and extracting value. So actually, Hungary remains in a bad bargaining position in global value change, but nevertheless, this critique stands, which has been only copied and mirrored by the opposition quite unimaginatively. On the left bottom, you could see, we will not become a colony, and you can see the Soviet symbol. Their flag is put beneath the inscription. And also the two-tailed dog party, which is actually joke party on the top right with the Russian flag. We will not become a colony, will not become a colony of Russia. And actually in 2014, the political program of far-right Jobbik party for the national elections included coloniality as a prime concept. So against the colonially principled parties, including the government, we have to become an anti-colonial nation. So the opposition also employs post-socialist elements. The 1989 system change discourse of Russians go home and Soviet symbols. And recently, also what emerged as part of the discourse is Chinese colonialism. Chinese are, of course, communists, so they are part of this post-socialist discourse. Hungary will not become a Russian and Chinese colony. One case is the Fudan University investment, which was strongly supported by the government to build a university, a Chinese university, a communist university as termed by the opposition in Budapest. And what the opposition mayor did is that she erected signs depicting Chinese colonial atrocities, which caused various diplomatic conflicts. You could see on the bottom, like Free Hong Kong Street or Uyghur Martyrs Street, and such. So this was actually critiquing the government's opening to the East policy. Orbanistan has become only a way to position Hungary in this East-West slope or East-West axis. And the very strong East-West discourse was about, we have to evade Eastern backwardness, which is also only about authoritarianism. And that's why Orban is building authoritarian regime, because he's allying with these Eastern backward authoritarian states. So this very Eurocentric and white discourse prevailed. But another important feature was capturing decolonialism by these right-wing conservative circles. And interestingly, there was this this West-East post-socialist divide divided Europe into colonizers and non-colonizers in this government-supported discourse. Now, this illiberal appropriation of decolonial arguments has been really de-emphasized in this critique, which I mentioned, and all the literature on understanding the liberal revolt against the West. Okay, nevertheless, the rhetoric to focus on differentiation between whites through maintaining whiteness could be achieved by this distinction of the colonizer and the non-colonizer countries. So we are the non-colonizer whites, which is interesting to look at in comparison, because in Austria, Switzerland, or Scandinavian countries, the same arguments prevailed and were later on used in foreign policy to open up to the post-colonial global South, that we never had colonies, so we are the good Europeans and good whites. Márton Békés was an important propagator of these ideas coming from the government. What's interesting is that he carelessly cites like Antonio Gramsci's hegemony concept and African authors well known in post-colonial studies for the sake of proving that we must also protect our indigeneity, as in this discourse, but there's never a comparison and no dialogue. Therefore, it's actually about white fears of not becoming a colony, appropriating the colonial criticism coming from the post-colonial South. Meanwhile, there is a total ignorance of leftists on this discourse and the broader histories that are mobilized in these discourses. When this colonial victimhood has been constructed as a strongly nationalist discourse by government, can be seen in Orbán's celebratory speeches. We are the small nation which has been abused throughout history by great imperial powers. The igniting moment was 1526, when the Ottoman Empire's invasion divided the country, and the Habsburgs took over Hungarian kingdom, the western and the northern parts. So interestingly, this was for almost 150 years, and you could compare this to the African colonialism, which lasted for like 7 or 8 years. Such comparisons are never done. So whether the Ottoman invasion was about colonialism is still a question. So this discourse is about we have protected Christian Europe from Islam, and later on the independence wars 1711, 1848 against the Habsburg Empire were also part of this nationalist rhetoric. So we tried to gain sovereignty, which we, according to the government, only obtained now after 1989, because throughout, Nazi occupation and oppression and Soviet rule, we gained our freedom in 1989, finally. So the government is exploiting the idea that this is a second conservative revolution coming, finishing the struggle for sovereignty after 1989, which culminates after 2010. So what's this national victim is a provincialized discourse. So as I said, there's no comparable instances outside post-socialist Eastern Europe, which is now cast as Central Europe, which the concept represents the shift towards Europe and whiteness. And Central Europe for Orbán, for example, becomes this classic Europe, which preserved its inherent nature. And it's something that the West should copy, right? Now, what I try to show is that this has a much wider global history. And through my approach, and this is why I use semi-peripheral whiteness, and I try to show you through these examples, is that, as I said, the liberal government has been framed as a variant or deviation of liberal democracy. But there's been no analysis on these discourses which are prevailing, that we never had colonies, so this denial, but we were always colonized, which is interestingly saying that we were part of global colonial history, only that we were decolonized. And finally, that we have no responsibility for the consequences of colonialism and imperialism, which has become a rhetoric, which has been a part of a bargaining position for Hungarians against the West and the European Union, within the European Union. So building on more systemic approaches, I tried to introduce this concept of semi-peripheral whiteness to capture this structural dynamic of core periphery in-betweenness. So Hungarian history has been about dependency on the global core, which surfaced and manifested in, for example, indebtedness. And especially from the 19th century, you could see these variations of whether following an export oriented agricultural modernization or import substitution industrialization, which are beneath this dynamic of trying to lever this dependency and modernize the economy. And the story is also about how these elite capital fractions try to integrate into global capitalism through this semi-peripheral position. So from this perspective, race and coloniality will become the articulations of these semi-peripheral strategies to integrate into global colonialism, into global capitalist economy. And when we look at race and coloniality, you could see through this in-betweenness, this positioning game of we are part of the white global core, so we help the white global core in exploiting the colonized peripheries, the non-whites, but on the other hand, we also position ourselves as different from these whites, the innocent whites or the good whites, which are helping the periphery in their struggle against the global core. So there are various instances in Hungarian history, in the socialist period, for example, in 1848 revolution, independence war, or in these various struggles to gain alliances against the global core in order to achieve a sovereign status. And this results in, racializing Hungarianness in ways that are non-white, either through solidarity or identification with non-white positions, as I'll try to show, becoming the white Negro, for example, identifying with the Black position, or the Asian origins of Hungarians being a nomadic nation originally coming to the Carpathian Basin, and through these nomadic origins having this racial origin identity connecting us to Central Asian peoples, which will be the Turanic peoples. So this structural maneuvering is something that has been, this positioning dynamic surfaced in recent conservative illiberal government discourse after 2012 against the liberal multicultural imperialist West. And this is something which has a longer history. So to understand the current discourse, we need to dig deeper. So just a few instances to show, I tried to show a few cases of the existing discourse. What's the problematic behind these? So Hungary, was it a Habsburg colony? And interestingly, the Hungarian historians' interpretations are that no, because actually they were legitimate rulers and they were helping the Hungarians fight the Ottomans, and actually they helped Hungarians reach their golden age within the empire, even though we were fighting them. So this kind of struggle is internalized by most, I think, quite conservative Hungarian historians' understandings. There was this recent roundtable, what did the Habsburgs give us? And what was interesting is that the main arguments were that if not protecting Christianity, they were actually protecting Central Europe. It was more about religious conflict in the nation. Ottomans looted, the Habsburg were protectors, providers, and organizers. And they also emphasized this communist role later on in building this Habsburg colonialism narrative. So through the socialist era, throughout the socialist era, this kind of Habsburg colonialism argument was very important to prove that we were actually colonized, right? And it was also because they were opening up to the decolonizing countries in Africa and Asia. So this was part of their argument, which was useful at that time. It's part of nationalist memory politics fighting for independence. And what I saw is that they actually not critiquing the government's standard understanding of that we were colonies of the Habsburgs. But what's more interesting is that there's no reflection on the on globalizing this kind of the Habsburg rule, for example. So during that time of the Ottoman invasion, as you could see, Hungary was divided into three parts. The western and northern part remained under Habsburg rule. Transylvania came semi-independent, and the Ottoman intrusion affected the central areas. During that time, the Habsburg rule extended throughout Europe in vast areas, and during this, the rule of Charles V was also about the colonization of the Americas. So there was much more forgotten connections between this kind of Atlantic expansion and also the economies, the economical reactions to this, which affected Hungary. And I'd show you a few examples, but the other thing was also that there was a Habsburg colonization, because after the Ottoman invasion, they repopulated the lands, which was a internal colonization of Hungary, which then resulted in this multi-ethnic composition. But of course, the 1848 independence war was also about remaining as part of the empire. It was never actually about full independence, which is also a tricky fact of this era. The integration of Eastern Europe into this growing Atlantic economy was about second serfdom and refeudalization, so providing agricultural products. But there were also various colonial products which affected Hungarian consumption, like tobacco or substitute products like against sugar cane production came sugar beet production. So these histories have not been actually looked at by these authors, and it's something that the connection of maritime metropoles linking to these hinterlands should be more opened up. Now, the second connected argument is whether we were a Western colony, and the prime organizer of this discourse is the Trianon trauma. After the First World War, we lost 2/3 of our territories, as shown in this small propagandistic map. Interestingly, this was based on the 14 points, the principles of self-determination by Woodrow Wilson, which also was, so these racist Wilsonian principles were racist in the US, were also an influence for later Afro-Asian decolonization, attaining sovereignty just as in the region as it happened in Central Europe. Afro-Americans later on referred to this as, attaining freedom in Central Europe through Trianon. So it was also about, for the other new nations, it was also Hungarian trajectories to get back the old lands were part of Hungarian imperial supremacy. And Hungarians also looked at Trianon as an act of the winner's side of competing imperial powers. And they later on sought to gain back these lands through allying with Germans. And I show you two instances. One is the Mitteleuropa concept, which is German Central Europe, which is largely about German imperial ambitions within Europe and Central Europe mostly, and also the colonization of the East, as it later on culminated in the Nazi expansion towards the East, and also the Holocaust. And behind that, this sort of Lebensraumpolitik of, we need the land for an expanding vital nation. Now, the main debates were about this. On the left, you could see this map, which was also used for propaganda reasons by the Nazis, but also embedded in a wider trajectory of connecting to German diaspora and global colonialism, expanding global colonies in the global scale. So the debates were about using German imperial expansion for benefit or resisting. And the resisting part was this manifested in this rise of Hungarian discourse of indigenousness, preserving Hungarian race, especially from the folk writers who frequently made parallels, colonial parallels with the existing colonies. And the benefiting side was the pan-Europe movement. So Richard Kudenov-Kalergi's and Austro-Hungarian diplomats movement, pan-European movement, also had effect in Hungary. And the Hungarian Pan-Europe Society was established in 1926, the Pan-Europe Congress. And this was an interwar era liberal bourgeois group who wanted to build tariff and economic union using this German hegemony, but also resurrecting the Austro-Hungarian monarchy's traditions and infrastructures to evade Balkanization in the South, and which meant political fragmentation and chaos in this very Orientalist, casting of us as whites in Central Europe and them as non-whites. They silenced the links to the Eurafrica projects that actually pan-European movement was about maintaining Africa as a colony, Europe the head and Africa as the body, as Kudenov-Kalergi said, and using which was meant to be used to again invest European capital. And part of also the pan-European movement was, which surfaced in the League of Nations debates, is that European peace rested on a just redistribution of colonies, which should be provided also to Central Europeans. So there was also a revanchist colonialism on behalf of Hungarians who, for example, by 1936 supported Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia on these terms. So they were actually supporting these imperial powers. Now, the last element was Hungary a Soviet colony? And in this, what I try to show is that there was actually, after World War II, a race for recognizing the region as being colonized between the communist and the anti-communist parts. Ferenc Nagy was the first Hungarian democratically elected prime minister of Hungary after the Second World War. He was exiled by the Rákosi regime, the communist regime, to the USA. I'm actually processing his materials as part of the Ferenc Nagy Prime Minister Research Group, which I founded. So the Soviet colony argument was about tokenizing by the US the Eastern Europeans as colonial victims of the Soviet Empire. And Ferenc Nagy toured Asia on the occasion of the 1955 Bandung Conference in order to affect the outcomes of the Bandung Conference so that colonialism should be condemned in all its forms, as it happened in the resolution that they accepted. So there were vast debates during the Bandung Conference by colonial and recently decolonized countries that should Soviet colonialism be part of colonialism. You could see these posters in New York depicting Khrushchev, for example, in this colonialist position as a colonial white. And we must resist this Soviet colonialism. So the race was countered by the communists later on throughout the 1960s. The 1956 revolution kind of put a halt to any kind of foreign policy maneuvering, which was not really, Hungarian state was not in the capacity to maneuver during the 1950s in the era of rapid industrialization. So this race for anti-colonial solidarity then resulted in socialist internationalism. Here I put the example of Ghana. Ghana was very important from 1961 on to Hungary because it was a rising, emerging state. And such countries like Ghana and Egypt and India were very important in not just forging an Afro-Asian alliance or Pan-Africanism, as Kwame Nkrumah tried to do, Ghanaian president, but also for the Hungarians to, through these countries, through this resistance, growing resistance towards the core, allying, searching for allies, as they also were through the European integration, they were left out of the markets. So there was also an isolationist, protectionist politics from Western European nations, which affected the Eastern socialist bloc. So they needed allies, they needed trade allies, but also both sides tried to lever the dependencies of the global core. So it was actually, a happy alliance when the Eastern European socialist states tried to export their industry, export products, but mostly knowledge and planning knowledge in order to demonstrate that they are anti-colonial and also anti-racist. So, sorry, this example shows that Hungary has put together the first 7-year development plan of Ghana in 1962, which was an igniting moment of this opening up to the post-colonial global South. The racial solidarity was connected to semi-peripheral development because Hungarian economy was in need of foreign currency to fund technological development and also to pay back loans which were taken up. So this constant drive to gain foreign currency caused huge pressures, affected huge pressures on the economy and state companies to export. By the 1970s, there was a huge drive. Some companies had like more than 30 or 40% of their production going on to these export markets in order to gain foreign currencies. In the end, throughout the 1980s, sorry, I'll return to this, the 1980s, there was a growing indebtedness after the oil crisis, and the petrodollars of the Eastern European economies were spent, invested. Some of these loans were never paid back because they were invested in the Middle East, for example, or to African countries, which also suffered from the 1980s global indebtedness crisis, which is a push from the global core through this financialization process to somehow regulate these indebted economies, which now couldn't pay back the loans because the loans became, through the Volcker shock, very expensive. So what was the problem is that everybody wanted to pay back the West. So these solidarities between Eastern Europe and the global South kind of shattered. And I give these examples of the 1980s, where there was a growing pressures to produce export products. Textile industry was very important, but we were all already competing with the Asian tigers, right, in textile production. And they imported cheap labor, for example, from Cuba, in order to produce products cheaper, right? Now, these were exploited, these workers, both by the Cuban government and the Hungarian government, and they were kind of isolated, but still the Cuban workers are a good example because, for example, the atrocities, racial atrocities between the local population and Cubans, and also the exoticization and the sexualization of Cuban workers led to, for example, the birth of the skinhead movement in Hungary. So all these kind of white identifications against this socialist internationalism, which was defined as inefficient and also colored. So it was about this kind of colored relations, right? So that's why I termed the 1989 revolution, the return to Europe and the return to a market economy, a white revolution, in the sense that these connections shattered, right? And lastly, actually, just to finish, because I don't have that much time for all the other slides, the question, okay, so we were victims of colonialism, and you could see this complicated positioning of how this semi-peripheral structural condition led to various, either seeking alliances, strategies of seeking alliances, anti-racist, anti-colonial arguments and solidarities, for example, or connecting back to the core and identifying with this white position. And you could see how complicated these positions were. But actually, what's even more complicated, if you look into the ways which are particularly silenced in Hungarian history, how we actually connected or integrated into global racial colonialism. So into the wider economies of global racial colonialism. If you look at this map, these were the actual real Hungarian attempts to gain colonies. Most of these are connected to Austro-Hungarian monarchy. The main argument is that we never tried to, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy did not try to get colonies, which is not true. But on the other hand, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, through its position, being in the center of a relatively landlocked area, economy, tried to position itself in global trade and in the concert of Europe of trying to maintain this alliance or stability between the competing European empires. And also the Hungarian, many Hungarian attempts to colonize were then directed towards the east, whether through building relations in Asia or colonizing the Balkans, so expanding through the south at the time when there was a scramble for Africa. So there were various alternatives, but the main problem with this common view, which you could see in this map, we never had colonies, was that it's a territorial understanding of colonialism and coloniality, which is utterly wrong, because there were various ways you were integrated into colonial economy. The Hungarian merchants, sailors, mercenaries active in global colonialism. There were Jesuit missionaries or various other missionaries active in missionary work, for example. And the other problem is that it's a nationalist viewpoint. So Spanish, Portuguese, British colonialism, we talk about Hungarian colonialism. These are all nationalist frameworks, which did not exist at that time for hundreds of years. There were much more complicated alliances and connections, as we could see from the Habsburg example. I tried to showcase some of the works which start to deal with this complicated economic history of how we actually integrated into the Atlantic economy and also the slave trade, slave economy. There's a huge German bias in this literature. So very few explore Polish or Hungarian or other Eastern European positions. Another concept that I've been using to understand this complicated integration into global colonialism was inter-imperiality, but mostly my own concept of transcoloniality coming from this literature. Barbara Arna's work shows the various forms of and definitions of the colony. And these concepts, which I use, actually show or try to show how these various typologies of colonialism does not work. Because speaking of internal and external colonialism or various forms of colonialism, silence the ways that these were inherently interconnected. So, for example, the internal colonization of Hungary during the Habsburg era, when the Ottoman invaded lands were repopulated, was actually connected to the Western frontier in the US and also Russian expansion to the east. The ways of how to colonize, how to build colonies, the technology, the knowledge was circulating, right? And also these connections of, for example, 18th century recruitment areas of the Dutch East India Company is a good example where you could also see Hungarians working in the late 18th century in the Dutch East India Company as high-ranked sailors or mid-rank soldiers. Also Hungarian Jesuits in China, for example, and I just want to show you a few photographs from the Jesuit library archives, Jesuit archives. Chinese children reading the Zaslong, which was a quite propagandistic magazine of Christian magazine, right? We could also talk about white colonial consumerism. So on the left, you could see pulp novels, which accentuate the global differences and also the global racial hierarchies of the whites, the yellow, and the black races. The yellow races are always spies or, poison makers or in this kind of mysterious, mischievous position. The blacks are always the savages. Or you could see that there were human zoos also in Hungary in the end of the 19th century, which existed later on. And also this Hungarian position, The Hungarian Boy of Congo, is a novel about, this small nation position of how we could also be just like the whites in this imperial and colonial culture. But another layer, and just a few other examples left, is white colonial escapism. So already the 1848ers, who contested Habsburg rule through independence wars, later because this war failed, they left to other places like Ottoman Empire or the USA. And this example shows actually there was also a theater play about this history, the founding of New Buda, which was a colony in the middle of the USA, so in the prairie region. They had these ideas of, okay, we were beaten by the Habsburgs, so let's refound the Hungarian Republic elsewhere. And actually, this idea was something that manifested in Jewish colonialism, which Hungarians also had important connections. Theodor Herzl was actually called Herzl Tivadar in Hungarian, who was born in Pest. And he devised this idea of Jewish territorialism, which was against Zionism. It was about building a colony elsewhere in the existing colonies, for example, in East Africa, which later fed into communist ideas of, agriculture and social system, but also into the colonization of Israel later on. Israel Zangwill, for example, came up with the idea of the melting pot in his theater play that he wrote in the early 20th century. This was all addressing Russian pogroms, Eastern Europeans fleeing to the US, and Zangwill was important in trying to lobby for an autonomous state for the Jews in the USA. Some people like Adam Rovner write about this if you're interested in the literature. But another Hungarian example was, there was Maurice de Hirsch, a very, very wealthy businessman who founded a trust and founded the Jewish Colonization Association to help the Jews fleeing from Russian pogroms to settle in the Americas. In North America, you could see some of the colonies, and also in South America. Interestingly, the main director of the Jewish Colonization Association was Zsigmond Sonnenfeld, who was a Hungarian. And they were very active in propagating this idea in Hungary. This is also something that actually nobody looked into, which is part of the post-Holocaust memory politics of, dissecting this kind of Jewish colonial victimhood is in the fore, and dissecting Jewish history and also the Holocaust from global colonialism, and how Jewish history integrated into this wider global colonialism. But in this case, in this very interesting white and non-white position of fleeing racialization as non-whites in Europe, and to the colonies where they could be considered whites, but still in a peripheral position. So nobody actually gave autonomy to the Jews, except for later on Stalin in Birobidzhan. Okay, so just a few examples in a few minutes, is that this is also connected to Hungarian settler colonialism. 1.5 million Hungarians went in the late 19th century and the early 20th century to the USA, and many of these became colonists. So most went to the industrial centers. But after the 1920s, so maybe Hungarians shot Indians, and you had these various interactions with the Native American population. But later in the 1920s, the quota-based, quite racist anti-immigration policies were enacted, or laws, which were directed against mostly the coolie labor, Asians, and Eastern Europeans. In some cities, some towns, 70% of the population were Eastern European. So there was this WASP kind of racial panic or white panic against Eastern Europeans. So many of these Eastern Europeans then went to Latin America, either to bypass through Cuba and Mexico this anti-immigration policy and reach USA, or just to settle in Brazil, South Brazil, and Argentina. And many of these people were not bourgeois people, but poor peasants. Actually, after 1920, the Trianon crisis, 80% of these immigrants came from the post-Trianon territories. So the territories that were detached from the Hungarian kingdom, these people fled to South America. You could see some images, which I got from archives. What was interesting is that there was a strong Hungarian lobby in the interwar era of organizing these colonies, the white colonies, but they were actually considered inferior in this kind of racial and colonial states of Brazil and Argentina. And folk writers like Ferenc Kordas wrote about, went there for years as a teacher, Julian teacher, and wrote sociographies of these Hungarian colonies, which I'm digitizing from the archives. There are also Jesuit missionaries who tried to come up with an alternative idea of how to integrate this post-Trianon Hungary into global colonialism. So, for example, Béla Banga and Zoltan Jesuit missionaries fantasized about Hungarian Jesuit heritage of Indian reductions in the 17th and then 18th centuries, and fantasized about this racial brotherhood and missionary expansion. But this was posed against the colonialist, imperialist, racially perilous, Protestant, spiritless North American modern capitalism. And they sought to counter this by this kind of Western Atlantic and Protestant narrative of global colonialism, counter it with channeling Hungarian ambitions into emancipating the silent Southern colonial history. So they sought this semi-peripheral option of reaching out to the Southern colonies where we could revitalize our Hungarian nation. And they also devised these parallels with the Hungarian national landscape, the puszta, the wasteland, with a parallel comparisons with the pampa, with the South American wasteland, which could be a ripe, rich area for Hungarians to settle and root. There were also aristocrat colonizer who used the arguments of capital, so it could be beneficial for Hungarians to settle there. And also there was a state, the son of the governor of Hungary, Miklós Horthy, was made ambassador in Brazil. But these trajectories died out after the Second World War. Most of these countries joined the Allies against the Axis powers. And what's interesting in this post-socialist era, the Hungarian government has been reaching out to the diaspora. There are repatriations. They are gaining European Union passports, so that's one important incentive. And there are also material collections taken back. Now, this is an interesting moment contesting whiteness, because actually the government through this process says that they were actually Hungarians, but through including these people into Hungarian national worldview and national history, they're actually creolizing national history through these non-white positions in South America. So the role of post-socialist countries after 1989, this process of reaching out to the colonial diaspora is a very interesting and forgotten and silenced point. Now, since I don't have much time, I'm going to skip some of the slides, and I want to show you another two more examples. And one is about the Asian origins of Hungarians and us identifying with the Asian position of being non-whites. This is also connected to constructing the national landscape, the puszta, which was an orientalized landscape throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. So like German painters were painting the Hungarian puszta just as in Morocco or North Africa, it's like the desert, and these kind of aesthetics ruled over the depiction of puszta, the Hungarian landscape, which was made during the Romantic era in the mid-19th century into this landscape of the Hungarian race. So where we belong, because actually we are a nomadic race coming from Asia. So this is where we can attain Hungarian freedom, the freedom of the puszta, which Sándor Petőfi, the great poet of 1848, wrote the C-flat puszta. It was actually part of this compensation, imperial compensation beneath being a landlocked country, that we do have this steppe, we do have this connection which connects this geographic wasteland connection which connects us to Asia. So part of this nationalist romanticism of providing freedom. This was also connected to ideas of saying that the Carpathian Basin is part of this, ideal Hungarian place for the Hungarian race. It's a geological whole, as György Prince, the geographer, said. It was used in the colonization of Balkans when 1878 the Austro-Hungarian monarchy annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. Some of the Hungarian Hungarian scientists who and people who went there, these important travelers, were called the Balkan Columbus, and it was compared. The region Balkans was compared to Africa. It's the darkest Europe, as seen in the work of Ferenc Nopcsa, who was almost made into King of Albania. And it was all about also diverting migration links from Americas to the Balkans to enforce, Hungarian national expansion. And of course, it was also about attaining the Hungarian sea. So in order to become a white European nation, you had to have a sea. Now, this is connected to, as I said, these Asian origins of being not quite whites. Here you could see that this was developed as Turanism, which was especially exploited in the interwar era as a revanchist anti-Western rhetoric, which Orban also often employs. So that the West has beaten us, but now we will ally with our Asian brothers, and with them we'll beat the West. So Turan was about kind of Asian racial brotherhood between the Hungarians and the Central Asian peoples. Armin Várbéry, for example, fantasized about colonizing Eurasia in ways that was actually a scientific and cultural colonization. So it upheld this white position of we know what's best for the Asians. It's part of Hungarian Orientalism, of doing research on Asia, that Hungary obtained a very important position in Oriental studies. So why this is interesting is that the Kurultai Festival is a good example of showing why this is interesting. It's a festival about this remembering our Asian roots. It's a historical cultural festival, dressing up as old Hungarians. László Kövér is seen as Speaker of the National Embassy just recently at Kurultai. This was financed and promoted previously by the far right, by parties like Jobbik, and taken over in the recent years by the government. It's now promoted by state money. So that's why Fidesz politicians are part of this festival. Now, this is in the semi-peripheral positioning. This is also about, gaining alliances and gaining investment opportunities through, for example, the New Silk Road of China. So this kind of macro project reaching to Europe and European markets. Hungarian membership in the Turkey Council in 2018 made this very important. And now, lastly, I show you another last example, which is not going to be the Hungarian Indians, but going to be what I call the white Negro. So this is going to be my last example. So one are the instances when Hungarians try to identify the Blacks, which is the most subordinated position. How will this give you benefits? And the initial moment which I found, igniting moment, was 1848ers, after being beaten up by the Habsburgs, identifying with this abolitionist movements, American fight against Black slavery. So the Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, got a wide reception. It was actually written when Lajos Kossuth, the independence fighter, was exiled and touring in USA in 1851 and 52. And it has specific references to the Hungarian independence fight, as you can see in the quote above, referring to Hungarian independence fighters as a model for abolitionists in America. And this had to be censored. This had to be written out of the original, which also became a theater play, widely acclaimed. It was also connected to Ira Aldridge's tour in Europe, who was also featured in Pest. The Habsburg secret services asked him to leave after a time. because it was aggravating to have this kind of performances which are about identifying with Black emancipation and connecting it to Hungarian independence fight. There's a further, culture of how Black music and Black culture was used and interpreted in Hungary. In the interwar era, also the Romas were put in this kind of white position of they are playing Hungarian music against the Black jazz, for example. So a lot of nationalist and fascistic groups use these arguments. They are our Negroes, and how to contest this kind of Western so-called cultural threat, just threatening our indigenous cultures. But lastly, in the white Negro trope, I have 3 examples which you could read in my paper, and also held separate presentations, so I don't want to go into this in depth. One is the Hungarian interpretation of and reception and translation of Batuala, which was the first so-called Negro novel, where the main hero is a Black. It was written by René Maran, and it was actually a critique of French colonialism. Interestingly, it was interpreted in Hungary as an aesthetic product by people like Kossanyi. Dezső Kossanyi was the translator. He was a very West-centric figure. It was taken into Hungary because it was part of Parisian culture. And actually, the recently discovered anti-Semitic texts of Dezső Kossanyi kind of complicates the story of why it was important to import Batuala, this story. And the French colonial French anti-colonialist, anti-French narratives were excluded in the Hungarian reception. In fact, some people protested, like these proto-folk writers, Oscar Damó, protested against Batuala, as it's not actually focusing on Hungarian masses, Hungarian poverty. Why should we deal with the West? Why is the Negro race is important for us, as we also have poverty? So it's actually addressing this semi-peripheral position of race as a Western import, as we could see in the Black Lives Matter protests and the reception of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. Very similar structures rise. Also in the white Negro trope was my example, written in 1936, In Congo Will Not Die, by Jewish author Illés Kacér. It was actually the only and first Hungarian so-called Negro novel, which was a protest against Hitler and the growing Nazi and fascist tendencies. It's about a Black person who goes from West Africa to Paris and seeks fortune, gets in love with a bourgeois aristocratic plantation owner's daughter from the US, who goes back to the US. So he follows her to the US and gets lynched in the US before becoming a prolific author, which he wants to be. But in Paris, the main hero, Njangezi, meets the Pan-Africanist movement. So actually this book is a treatise about the Pan-Africanist movement, its promotion through Jewish eyes, the Jewish who were persecuted and attacked during the anti-Semitic interwar era. Why is interesting, this story, is that Illés Kacér was also Zionist. So after 1959, he moved to Israel and settled there, as an old man. He was also a communist and promoted these ideas behind them as these communist ideals. So in Israel, he becomes the white colonist, and he writes this book, which was actually written in 1924, but then later republished in 1967. So when this war was already going on and very tense between Israel and the Arab countries, this book was republished in Israel, which is actually a kind of aestheticization of the Jewish colonists in ways and through this aesthetic, which is very similar to the wider European depictions of the colonists, either in the Western frontier in the US or elsewhere. So I want to finish with, I have more examples, but I run out of time. So I want to finish this story, and I want to just jump onto the conclusive remarks. And we have this very rich Hungarian history of identifying with the Asian position, with the Black position, but also this kind of instances of white supremacy. And what my main premise was, or my main thesis, is that all these articulations, although connected to very particular positions, actually you could see the structural dilemma of us being not part of the West and us being in this part of Europe, but still a periphery of Europe and still on the margins of the global core. So addressing this kind of dynamic, which surfaces through coloniality and racial positioning. And why it's important to address these ideas and to look at this global history from this structuralist approach is to get a better idea of what the government is doing and what Eastern European countries are doing. For example, think about the war in Ukraine when promoting decolonial ideas and trying to grasp onto or capture the critique, which often becomes provincialized and not really put into dialogue with this rich, through this rich history with, for example, people in the global South or other colonial contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very exciting talk. I would now hand over to Prof. Makoni to begin questions and discussions.
Okay, Edwin, can you move the PowerPoint so that we can now see each other on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Oh, thank you very much for this presentation. That was quite helpful. I want to get into a conversation with you, starting from issues about class. The main focus of your presentation, and rightly so, has been on race, but it was only intermittently that you were raising issues about economic class. Now, my question is, if you had combined race and class and tried to tell your story, would that have been different? If you had combined analytically issues about class as well, would that have led you to interpret some of these events differently?
Should we collect questions or?
No, it's just a conversation. It's a conversation, right? And this is just a takeoff. And then later on, my colleagues will jump in and they will raise their own questions.
Yeah, so I understand that my approach is kind of complicated because it goes two ways. One is looking at the surface of the racial positioning and colonial discourse. And the other is kind of a structural, conditions and structural dynamics beneath. And it's hard to reconcile the two. And I'm glad that you raised this question because I just didn't want to overcomplicate stuff even further. But the class element kind of connects these two quite clearly. I just hinted in the beginning the fact that from a world systemic perspective, the main question is the mode of integration into the world economy and the strategies. And these are not just led by, but also framed by the economic and political elites, which are various, but they have limited options because of the conditions provided by this very hierarchical system, which is increasingly controlled by the hegemonic core. So when it comes to race and coloniality, and there's discourses on the surface, what you can mostly see is how the Hungarian elites tried to frame their positions and their integration strategies through colonial and racial positions. The Turanism example is a very good example. The Turanist example is very good in this respect because it's very elite-driven discourse. It becomes state subsidized, state supported, but still it offers it provides an opportunity. I didn't have time to go into this of not just far right political positions, but also socialists, to position themselves through Turanist arguments to say that we are anti-Western, we are protesting the West. So it offers a sort of, there are some instances in Hungarian history where these colonial racial discourses offers as a unity of these very different elite fractions, capital fractions, which are otherwise competing with each other to put forth their own strategies, which should be promoted as a national strategy or economic strategy of integration. But in the case of the Hungarian settlers in Latin America, and also those going to the US, you see that most of the population was, not privileged bourgeois as the 1848ers who went there because of political reasons, but were poor, were fleeing from economic hardship. And the question is, so were there, whether they were whites, and it was not just because this kind of Hungarian Asian origin led the US white supremacists to look at them as hunkies, as Asian barbarian Huns and hordes, So this racialization was not just because of the geographical position and the discourse of the elites, us being the tyrannic race, coming back at them, but also because of their low class status. They could be racialized, just as in the case of Irish Italians before them. And it's interesting to look in terms of class at the solidarity relations between racialized Hungarians and Afro-Americans, for example. An interesting structural process was at the time, because of the racial quotas in the 1920s, that resulted in keeping away East Europeans and Afro-Americans going to the north and occupying those positions in the cities. So these kind of class relations are important, not just because of going deeper into the wider globalized economic history of Hungary, and also we could talk about the remittance networks, which stabilized also the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. It was very important to the remittance networks were increasingly important by the late 19th century. But this is my last point. The different class position is also interesting because they did not write history. And many of these, as I could, the Ferenc Kordas sociographic materials on the Hungarian colonies in the frontier regions, the Chaco area in the interior in South America, is very important to see the voices, or hear the voices of these actually very peripheral Hungarian populations who are, by the elites, also the Brazilian, Argentinian, but also by the Hungarian elites, framed as, pioneer colonists and exploited. So they're driven from Hungary, but still exploited in the colonies, which makes us arrive at very interesting questions, like why are they white colonists? Because of their class status, and because of Hungarian semi-peripheral positioning, there's a reluctance of Hungarians to accept them as white colonists and to look at them as actually they were pushing the colonial frontier in the US and also in South America. So this arrives to the class focus makes us more aware of not just the narratives and the available knowledge, so who's telling us the story, but also of the various complicated and controversial ways that colonialism was put forth through these populations, through Jewish colonialism, which was about racialization and exile, and through the pushing out of Eastern European populations into the colonies. I hope this was one.
Yeah, this is true. I should know the answer to this, but I honestly don't know. So let me ask it. The way you are telling this story of semi-peripheral whiteness and the times African Americans, etc. In the history of African American political activism and even the Hungarian engagement with the United States, were there ever any political movements in which there was an alliance between African Americans and, let's say, the Hungarians? Because to some extent, they were all faced with a similar predicament, not white enough, for example, right? So you are on the periphery of the system. So my question is, do we have any history or which tries to capture the nature of the relationship between, let's say, the Hungarians and the African Americans, or the Hungarians and, yeah, let me stop there, because if I move to South America, it will become a different story. So I'm trying to work out, how did the African Americans, for example, relate to the Hungarians? And because the Hungarians were also concerned with issues about semi-peripheral whiteness. And then my question is there anything called semi-peripheral blackness, or semi-peripheral whiteness only? Semi-peripherality only applies to whiteness and not to blackness. Anyway, now.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's tricky. So semi-peripherality, from my perspective, is about this in-betweenness. And if you're talking about in-betweenness, I'm actually not interested in whiteness per se or blackness per se, but the kind of positioning dynamic.
Okay.
But it's an interesting question because for various reasons, and there's also, and there is it's quite asymmetrical, because as I tried to show, in most cases, and this is the danger of connecting back in history to these various anti-colonial struggles or anti-racist struggles coming from Hungary or Eastern Europe, is that they remain to be performative, articulated in a way that actually is trying to promote our whiteness. For example, the socialist internationalism was, as I tried to show, was a pressure because of European integration, isolationism, because of geopolitics, because of various reasons, but it was an economic pressure to open up to these countries and demonstrate our solidarity. Many of the travelogues, we have a book chapter coming out with Professor James Mark, Nemanja Radonjic, and Eric Burton about socialist era travelogues, and we look at the coloniality within the anti-colonial, in the sense not just how this kind of colonial consumerism persisted during socialist era, like hunting novels and travel novels and whatever, but the only change that they try to do within this framework of colonial consumerism is that they try to demonstrate that we are now the good whites. We were actually the solidary whites, we are the better whites. We could have been better than the imperialists if we had control. So it's actually showing this kind of brotherhood and solidarity in a way that is patriarchal in many respects, and it's also partly infantilizing the local population through this kind of modernization theory that you could also achieve our progress if you listen to us, but the socialist way is better. So there is an asymmetry in the semi-peripheral whiteness, which the current government is also exploiting in ways that are they're using all sorts of references in our global history, but in a way that actually promotes a Hungarian solid position in Europe. So this difference making and solidarity is, of course, true in many respects, but it actually serves this position of demonstrating that we are better whites than the whites themselves. So it's about developing above in the hierarchy from a semi-peripheral to a core position. There are less instances which is actually about this grander alliances with the global periphery and identifying with a position which is totally non-white, or in a way contesting whiteness itself as an ideology. So, and just to give you a few more examples on what instances were when there was a true, solidarity or a dialogue or some kind of connection, I've shown the 1848ers' connections to abolitionism,
Mhm.
but it was complicated by the fact, for example, that Lajos Kossuth, the great independence warrior himself, was against abolitionism. So there's the Kossuth statues and the wide propaganda in the US on Lajos Kossuth is controversial. The Black Lives Matter movement hasn't attacked yet Kossuth monuments, but though the statue politics, also whether it is supported by the Hungarian government now or not, becomes controversial. The other example was what I found was Jewish history. Obviously, in a very anti-Semitic context, where the Jews were racialized, also as Orientals, also as Africans, in some ways, so not whites or not quite whites. The Jewish found material connections of solidarity, as I tried to show, with the Afro-American movements, and there's literature on this connection. But ultimately, the post-Holocaust memory politics did not let this history to be exploited. The Kocér Illés story, which I gave, the example is very interesting because other Jews who were battling against fascism, like Miklós Ragnóti, my other example, which I didn't talk about, the great Hungarian poet, which was killed in 1944. He was promoted as a Jew who was fighting fascism, but Illés Kocér was not promoted so he was forgotten during socialist times because he was a Zionist. And the socialist state was anti-Israel. During the socialist era, they were supporting the Arab countries in their anti-colonial solidarity and saw Israel as, a puppet state of the US and the Western coalition. So such authors who wrote about Pan-Africanism, identified with the Black position, but were actually Zionists, were completely forgotten. And also there's a reluctance to identify with the Jewish colonial position because they become white colonists if we globalize the discussion. But they were actually, racialized populations who were not regarded white in Europe and the West. I could give you a few other examples, but I don't want to.
No, that's I think that's
time.
yeah. Well, yeah.
But I could. What I tried to show in my presentation, I think not that successful because it's a very complicated story, is that these instances of solidarity are driven by structural restraints and conditions and pressures. So the 1960s kind of detente era anti-colonial solidarity is a very good example, which kind of counter the romantic illusions of leftist academics who look at the socialist project as purely, an anti-colonial project. It's much more complicated through the actual experiences of racial violence persisting, and also this ongoing, continuing racial, colonial and racial consumerism in Hungarian culture.
Let me just pose the last question, and then after that, I'll hand over to Edwin. I can understand partially how the Black Lives Movement was, how the Hungarians responded politically, whatever, to the Black Lives Movement. But what I missed, because I was busy taking down notes, was what is the impact of the current Ukrainian war on issues about racial consciousness within Hungary? Are the Hungarians now more keen to amplify their whiteness in light of the Ukrainian war, or what are the dynamics that are taking place within Hungary because of the Ukrainian-Russian war?
Okay, I try to be short. So connecting first to the questions or aspects that were missed, I just wanted to highlight that I did not talk in depth about the Roma positions, but there was also, because I could talk about Roma abolitionism, in the region and also in Hungary, how this connected to Black positions, or whether these connected to Black positions. But what was the tendency in the region is to provincialize these critiques. They are our Negroes, as I tried to show in one slide. They are our minorities, and usually these histories have been nationalized. And there's now an ongoing more and more work about how to globalize, for example, Roma positions, Roma abolitionism, Roma slavery in this wider framework of global colonialism. So through the expansion of Atlantic, the economy, Black slavery, and then the development of capitalism, our integration into the world, this world economy, increasingly driven by European colonialism, how that affected Roma. I also have some stories and aspects on this. I just want to highlight this, that I could not talk about this, but the impact of the Ukrainian war is very complicated. Just to wrap up, Orban is following a maneuvering semi-peripheral positioning game. Which is much more complicated than simply saying that he's pro-Putin, because of course he is. So there is a very strong silencing of Russian violence. There's huge government-supported, state-supported propaganda about, not attacking Russia and attacking the Ukrainian so-called fascists more. This is also fueled by the fact that Hungarian minorities were given less and less rights in Ukraine in the past years, and the rise of Ukrainian nationalism, which is an obvious consequence of Russian aggression, is also strengthening this kind of a nationalist politics, which is affecting minorities. And you have to understand that Hungarians living in Ukraine, who've always lived in Ukraine, are also fighting in the war. So they're exploiting these kind of differences in ways that are taking away the critical impulse from Russia, again, that should be directed against Russia. But actually, it's about oil and gas. So actually, it's about maintaining a good position, which is also about maintaining a good position, not in relation to Russia, but in relation to China and other countries, showing a good example. We remain to be good business partners, whatever happens. So in this slide, you could see these performances of attacking EU sanctions. That's the highlight today in Hungarian governmental rhetoric, that EU sanctions are bad because they cause the crisis, right? So that's simplified in very, very problematic propaganda posters. But of course, the opposition is saying that, yes, now you can see that Orban is, the friend of Putin, and the dominant narrative is there's this interesting pro-Putinism, which is fueled by the government, which is interesting because Hungary is traditionally quite anti-Russian, anti-Bolshevik, anti-Soviet. You have this memory and traumas which make Hungarians anti-Russian, but still there's this interesting pro-Putin stance. But mainly it's about Putin is the East, Putin is authoritarian. So even the legitimate attacks on Russian violence are whitening Ukrainians in order to see the Russians as a barbaric, as the Ukrainian soldiers would say, orcs. So this dehumanization process is going on. Hungarian historians, spokespersons have mostly written about this critique of Russian imperialism, but without globalizing the discourse. So they remain white in the sense that they're locking this into the well-known East-West axis and provincializing the discourse. So it's about Hungarian trauma, and that's why we should also critique Russian Empire. And just the last point is that the whole conflict severed the connections between Visegrad 4 countries, and especially Hungarian relations to Poland, which have become critical because Poland is pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO, and also totally following anti-Russian politics. So it has shattered the wider ambitions of Orban to build a bigger alliance of Eastern European states within the EU to protest against the West. And this also connects to the failed attempts or ongoing attempts of Hungarians being the ones who are promoting the accession of Balkan states into the EU. So this kind of positioning game shattered, and Orban is under huge pressures because of a crisis. But most of the interpretations have been West-centric, whatever position you are on.
Thanks a lot. Let me hand over to my colleague Edwin to open up to the global audience, because there's a number of people who want to jump in. Edwin.
So to begin this, because our time is fast spent, for those asking the questions and for the answers, if we could be very brief a little bit, it would help. And so I'll begin with the questions so there are some questions and comments in the chat box, and then there are a couple of hands that are raised. I'll call them up. And so Faith is asking a question about semi-peripherality. And she's asking if this argument is based on having been profiting from colonialism, though not directly engaging in it. And so she wants to know the main arguments of semi-peripherality.
Should I answer now, or are we collecting questions?
Just answer, then we'll quickly move on. Yeah.
Those whose hands have been raised.
Well, I'm not 100% that I understand the question. I'm thinking about how to interpret it, because there are various ways to understand the question. The question is quite brief, but these are very big concepts. And there's one point which connects to this. So semi-peripheral, so there are two things. One is whether this was used as a way to engage with colonialism or not. And the other is this kind of wider origin or history of semi-periphery. The versus analysis itself came from the late 1950s, 1960s era, when dependency theory and all these other theories came up or emerged. Also because of Afro-Asian countries contesting, rising Afro-Asian countries' need for arguments of development. And these are very useful also for local authors to argue that they are a dependent economy and to think about ways to contest the global core. You must remember that, like under Gunder Frank, of course, the idea of dependency theory, his idea of dependency or Western analysis became promoted through the USA later on. So when it was globalized through the US Academy, and of course you had to channel into that. But his initial focus was West Africa. He went on to focus on Latin America afterwards. Immanuel Wallerstein was considered as one of the fathers of Western analysis, started looking in Ghana, in West Africa. So the origins of this theory come from these colonial, post-colonial areas, and it has been promoted by Eastern Europeans a lot, but it has seldom been used to connect these two regions. In Wallerstein's conception, semi-periphery actually sort of represented the Second World and this kind of socialist project of contesting the socialist core and being able to unite the periphery with the semi-periphery to contest the core. But the idea addresses that it's hard to break out of the hierarchy. So it's very much, it's critiqued in a way that it's actually reinforcing the sort of economic determinism, right? So you cannot break out of your position easily. But recently, and this is my last point, the concept has been, I think, used and abused, because those who have been, I've been involved in a group called the Public Sociology Group Helyzet in Hungary, and we were using this concept in Hungary and doing reading seminars, whatever. And later on, in the last few years, it had become very popular in leftist circles in Hungary, and also throughout Eastern Europe, especially the Balkans. But it has become so popular that it's missing the political economic critique and background. So it's usually just becoming a descriptive term, and therefore becoming a descriptive term, it usually reinforces whiteness, because it somehow says that we are not really a periphery, we're this sort of periphery. So usually I've seen many authors using the concept of semi-periphery in a way that's somehow evading the discussions about connecting semi-peripheral and peripheral positions, or connecting semi-peripheral positions across the world to look at how these development models might be compared to our Hungarian models. I looked into the history of this through the history of the Afro-Asian, the Center for Afro-Asian Research, which developed out of the Ghana job, which I put on my slides in 1963. So Ghana in development led to the establishment of this Hungarian center, which historically was one of the centers of thinking globally through these concepts.
Okay, thank you. So Scott.
Thanks very much, Edwin, and thank you very much, Zoltan, for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a very productive area of investigation. And I agree with you that if you look at a lot of the mainstream race theory coming out of the United States, especially, it does look like there's an inability to think race and coloniality outside of some very narrow contexts. However, I think that like kind of mainstream works like D'Angelo and Kendi that are written for a general audience are not really reflective of the richness and depth of race scholarship around the world. And there are many scholars out there who are looking specifically at these issues, specifically around how peripherality is perhaps central to whiteness and central to the way that whiteness is repeated and kind of, comes in different forms around the world. One example would be some of the critical race work that's being done on Hindutva in India, and how that ideologically mobilizes a lot of kind of, race thinking that is very similar to the kind of Western European race thinking. The example of Afrikaners in South Africa, who Christy van der Westhuizen has theorized as being like subaltern whites, again, not white enough, and therefore in the lead up to apartheid, a lot of Afrikaner nationalism, in fact, came from the sense of like an aggrieved whiteness or an embattled whiteness. And then, of course, the entire alt-right movement globally, which is really about saying, we're under threat. We are like the people, we need liberation. They deploy kind of liberation theology ideas. They deploy the rhetoric of social justice in the same way that Hindutva deploys the rhetoric of decolonization. So, even while I completely agree with you that the center is too West-centric and is kind of dominant, I think that it's not entirely true to say that race scholarship more broadly is not looking at this issue of peripherality. In fact, the notion of whiteness as always under threat is core to a lot of the theories. It's core to the literature on poor whites, for example. So I think that I would like to see a little bit more engagement there in the way you frame your argument with some of that scholarship too.
Should I answer now?
Oh yeah, this is just a conversation.
Okay. Okay, sorry. I always ask that. Okay, so thank you. I agree but disagree. What's the geography behind the knowledge production that you are talking about? So, okay, there's literature on poor whites and subaltern whiteness. Where? Or about what context? You could do comparisons with the Irish history, Hungarian history, European. You could do comparisons with other these histories where this kind of whiteness has been, this kind of peripheral whiteness has been exploited, or other forms. But has there been discussion or dialogue? There's little, not enough. And the other one is I put in these popular instances of Candy and D'Angelo for a good reason. And that is that they are popular, they are making capital, and when they are coming to Europe, for example, like Candy, their behavior of whether they are engaging with local literature, local voices or not, is kind of informative about this West centrism, because there's not real engagement. However, the local interpreters and commentators are engaging with this literature because this is the bestseller and this is about capital, and their engagement with this type of literature leads to the popular disengagement with the type of literature that you are addressing and saying that there is literature, but there's little engagement, especially popular and media and public engagement with this literature, which is a problem. But behind all this is that this is also a critique of decolonialism, which I want to return to, how decolonialism has been actually practiced. It has become, decolonialism is a practice, mostly. Of course, it's a critique, and it has become an academic critique, but a lot of the criticism is not addressing the material politics behind knowledge production. The actual fact that, for example, if you look at ERC projects, big European research projects, the latest data is that 1.8% was given from these funds to Eastern Europeans. Most of where we're supposed to go are Western conferences. There are decolonial summer schools in the West. One good counterexample is the decolonial summer school, which terminated, by the way, in Telciu, in Romania, which was at a village. And we could talk about the ways of actually producing knowledge or engaging with the local audience. So who are you addressing? What is your audience? Most of the problems with decolonialism and are two things. One is the ignorance of Eastern Europeans themselves, and the Ukraine war was very. The Ukraine war was very. I mean, it was a clear. It clearly showed how they were tokenizing Ukrainians, but not actually involving them in dialogue. That has changed in the past few months, but initially we started with this. And so this is the first thing, the geography of knowledge production. And the second thing is that, are we actually contesting the structural inequalities through decolonialism, or are we just selling our academic work through, another way to frame it? And that's what they actually do, even using the war of Ukraine, that now everybody's talking about decolonialism connected to the Ukrainian war, even those who have not engaged with the literature in that depth, or it's not clear how this is not just, provincializing the discourse, or is it West centrism, or how this is building actual dialogue, for example, with the global South, or, contesting these wider structures, which is not just about one position, but about wider. So decolonialism should be a global critique. And that's why I deal with global history, because showing these global interconnections allow us to show how these positions are much more complicated, and there's much more work to be done to actually build alliances, and not just, the Hungarian audience was stunned by the fact that the lack of African condemning of Russian aggression, and they have no idea about the Cold War history of this position or Russian activity in Africa or whatever. So anyway, it's much more complicated, I think, and that's why I use semi-peripheral whiteness, because I'm trying to contest the structural relations and inequalities, and that should be addressed not just the discourse. And I have a good example, but I don't have time to tell you of how through Christianity, I have a paper coming up of how Orban and the Fidesz regime is using Christianity, not just as a local discourse and identity politics or conservatism, but to open up to African countries, because there are more Christians living in Africa now than in Europe. And Christianity has become the main ideology substituting socialist internationalism, so succeeding socialist internationalism. Christianity has become this way of opening up to these countries, which is not reflected upon because it counteracts all these opposition arguments and the critique against Orban. It somehow complicates the story.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie, you can ask your question.
Thank you. I try to be quick. So perhaps from the position of an African studies scholar, decolonial scholar in the Czech Republic, obviously a lot of your presentation, I saw the parallels to this country, the framing of the Black Lives Matter as racist and all these things. What I have a general concern about, and I guess that's as an African studies scholar, is when we conceptualize semi-peripheral whiteness, or, for example, Kalmar's work on white to be white but not quite, and I'm not sure you criticize Kalmar's work just on the basis of not engagement with sufficiently with the historical trajectory, but for example, Kalmar's work, from my perspective, is problematic simply from the idea that he also pushes the argument to say that what Eastern Europeans or Central Eastern Europeans experience is racism from the West, yeah. And I think that it becomes problematic from the perspective that simply if we look at it from the perspective that someone who's positioned in a semi-peripheral space, as you say it, one is not only a victim, but also a perpetrator, as you showed quite well in the presentation, right? So you might experience a form of discrimination, in whatever form you might want to describe it, but at the same time, you're also very much perpetrator of a racism, for example. And in a more, I'm saying this as a worry and as a concern, because I wonder how useful is it for scholars who work on race to employ, for example, to stretch racism as being perpetrated by the West against the East, for example, within Europe. And I guess on a more tangible, practical level, in how far that doesn't take away or blurs rather the real struggle of people of color in the world. Yeah, that I simply don't think that we can do away with phenotype, right? So when it comes to actual race scholarship, I think that is my worry, specifically in reference to Kalmar's work, because he really does push that argument to racism. I'm not sure if this is something that you've really engaged with, because your work is different, but it would be interesting for me to hear your position on this.
Well, first of all, I really admire, you mentioned a lot of things, but you pointed out Kalmar's work. Well, we must first of all accept that we cannot be as white as his beard, of course, but he does write about racialization, that this kind of racialization of Eastern Europeans quite strongly. He's actually addressing a Western audience, in my view, in order to offer this very important critique that, but the West is racializing Eastern Europeans. But he offers a lot of examples. The problem is that from the first, it's kind of sometimes, yes, pushing race in ways that are not actually addressing the structural dilemmas and the structural positions that I'll try to address. His use of semi-periphery is quite indicative. He merely lists data or describes, but does not show, in many cases, the structural dynamic behind the motivations of articulating such and such positions. And in this case, race only becomes kind of a policing around, wielding West-centric theory and policing around and showing what was racist and what is not, and not actually engaging with the structural stakes of the locals. Like what's at hand, what's at stake from our perspective, which is much more complicated than race. In my view, it's articulated through race. Of course, race feeds into capitalist production and accumulation, but still an overemphasis on through critical race theory in most cases. And it's also an overemphasis in the ways of which I didn't have time to talk about, of this colorism, which simply doesn't work, or doesn't work in the way as it's supposed to be in this region. And this disengagement with this series, the second point, which also connects to Kalmar's work, is that, first of all, he's ignoring the vast amount of work that has been done in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe by many other authors who've engaged with decolonial theory, post-colonial studies, the Orientalization. So it's already there, and there's much more material to build on. And the second is that there's less historical evidence or work, which I tried to produce in the past, like since 2015, I've been working with Professor James Mark, and that's why we're working on the book together for Cambridge University Press. We're trying to include all these vast historical evidence. It's not really turning into the direction of globalizing the arguments and opening up towards, for example, we didn't mention, what about whiteness in the Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire's legacy? Turkish whiteness, for example, has been used, Arab whiteness, or more talk about Latin American positions or elsewhere. We're trying to organize a workshop with James Mark on this, of getting these people together to globalize the discussion, because I get the sense that Kalmar's work is from a Western position addressing the West, even if it's about very important statements and things happening in Eastern Europe. So that's my answer.
Okay.
But basically, I agree with what you said.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think there are a few comments in the chat box, and there's a question also by Teboho. And so Teboho is asking this question. He starts by saying, I thank Prof. Zoltan for the presentation of other parts of the South in Europe. Can you briefly clarify? I only read recently of this honesty of European Greece, like Hegel, who informed Marx on dialectics, and also said that Africa was not part of history, when in fact there was massive literature on Egypt. Along this distorted history, the European history said the Austro-Hungarian Empire started a world war with one suppression of Serbian nationalism. How could Hungary be that hegemonic and also be reflected as colonized?
Well, that's the basic idea. It can be both. From whose perspective are we talking from? That's, I think, the main thing. But we have to understand that when we're using these concepts like semi-periphery or even whiteness or race, it becomes kind of clumsy, and it's really hard to apply them, use them, and make them become informative epistemic tools when we deal with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, but with other empires too. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a very multi-ethnic empire, and there are very, as I tried to show in the beginning, very complicated positions. So even the Hungarian independence was about remaining in the empire, but just becoming, a more independent nation, having our own language, of course, but tariff zones, but becoming, but being part of the economic, sort of economic union. So not about anti-imperialism in the sense of, it was, of course, about republicanism, but not in the economic sense of not saying that we do not want the privileges that brings us. And about Marx and a lot of course, there are these political debates and academic debates across decolonial theory. So the more of a Latin American school of decolonialism conflicts with these socialist and post-socialist region, and with this kind of memory politics also, and research on the role of state socialist countries. Because if coloniality is modernity, then of course socialist modernity was also colonial, and there are these complicated theoretical discussions which are now more and more empirically focused. But this discussion and this debate showed not just a kind of geographical, sometimes competition or conflicts, but also that we need to dig deeper in this history of socialism, and also reaching back to Marx. There was this book called Decolonizing Dialectics. Maybe that was the book that Teboho was referring to. I'm not sure. There was this huge debate, and what I could see in especially the Balkans, people who are more leftist leaning when it comes to post-colonial studies and the critique of colonialism, there was no dialogue. Vivek Chiber, for example, wrote a penetrating critique on this kind of a post-colonial studies of coming from the Indian tradition, like Gupta and others, Chakrabarti. What I saw is that there was no active engagement in these debates from the Eastern Europeans. And when it comes to Marx, I'd like to highlight that there's very little focus on what actually Marxism, Leninism, the socialist movement, the socialist option, socialist development meant for those countries, for example, in India or African countries. They might have a very different view of what it actually meant, which is very different from our Eurocentric projections of the Marxist heritage and what this meant for our and European history. So I think more focus on that position is something which we tried to approach in our exhibition, the Transperiphery Movement, in 2021, when we tried to look at what that memory meant for those people and try to decenter through that memory this kind of Marxist heritage and memory politics, or intellectual heritage, so to say, which is cultivated here, which is mostly provincializing the discourse. So that was my experience. We're not engaging with that literature much. That's actually my point.
Thank you so much for the very interesting answers. So I'd like to hand over to Vishnia, who would tell us about the speaker for next week, and then we can move to a little bit of the next session.